At 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Denver, Colorado, Sarah Mitchell was about to prove that 20 years of condescending remarks, rejected applications, and professional dismissal would all become irrelevant in the next 4 minutes and 13 seconds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency alert pierced through the mountain facility like a digital scream. Sarah Mitchell looked up from her workbench where she'd been carefully examining the internal mechanisms of a vintage World War II mine, part of her ongoing research into obsolete explosive devices that the Colorado Defense Research Institute had assigned her as busy work. All personnel to emergency stations, code red, nuclear incident at Sector 7. Sarah's hands stilled on the delicate brass components. She'd heard those words in countless drills, but never with that particular edge of panic and Director Harrison's voice echoing through the facility speakers. Within minutes, the hallways filled with running technicians, senior engineers, and military personnel. Sarah stood in her doorway, watching the controlled chaos unfold. Nobody stopped to brief her. Nobody even looked in her direction. After 15 years at the facility, she had become invisible to everyone except the janitors and the cafeteria staff. Dr. Marcus Webb rushed past, his security clearance badge swaying as he moved. Sarah had submitted 17 different proposals to work with Webb's team over the years. Each one had been politely declined with variations of the same theme: insufficient experience with modern systems, lack of proper certification, limited understanding of contemporary explosive technologies. The irony wasn't lost on her that she probably knew more about explosives than anyone in the building. Her grandfather had been a demolitions expert in Korea, her father a bomb disposal technician in Vietnam, and she'd grown up taking apart fireworks and studying blast patterns in her backyard. But formal credentials trumped intuitive knowledge in government facilities. And Sarah's background in art history with a self-taught expertise in explosives didn't fit into neat bureaucratic categories. She grabbed her tablet and pulled up the facility's emergency protocols. As a Level 2 support staff member, she wasn't authorized to access real-time incident reports, but she could monitor general status updates. What she saw made her blood run cold. Sector 7 housed the facility's nuclear waste storage and contained 3 experimental tactical nuclear devices that were scheduled for decommission. According to the limited information flowing through official channels, there had been a catastrophic failure in the containment system, and one of the tactical devices had been damaged in a way that compromised its safety mechanisms. Sarah's fingers moved across her tablet, accessing databases she wasn't supposed to be able to reach. Years of being overlooked had taught her to be resourceful, and she'd learned to navigate the facility's digital infrastructure through patient observation and careful boundary testing. What she discovered in the classified files made her stomach drop. The damaged device was a Mark 41 tactical nuclear warhead, manufactured in 1987 and containing enough plutonium to contaminate a 50-square-mile radius if it went critical. More troubling, the incident had been caused by a chemical leak that had corroded the device's primary containment housing and damaged its electronic safety systems. Through her unauthorized access, Sarah learned that the facility's bomb disposal team was already on site. Led by Dr. Webb and supported by a joint military-civilian task force, they represented the best expertise the government could assemble on short notice. These were the people who dismissed her applications, the ones who had relegated her to studying museum pieces while they handled real explosive threats. But as she continued reading the incident reports, a pattern emerged that made her realize why she was reading these updates from her dusty workshop instead of being evacuated like a normal person. The Mark 41 was old enough that its documentation had been lost in multiple database transfers. The original technical manuals were stored in physical archives that would take hours to locate. The device used analog firing mechanisms that predated the digital systems that current bomb disposal experts had trained on. Sarah walked to her filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Historical Nuclear Devices Personal Research. Inside were photocopied pages, hand-drawn diagrams, and detailed notes she'd compiled over years of studying weapons that the facility considered obsolete. Page 47 contained everything she'd been able to piece together about the Mark 41 series. She'd first encountered references to the Mark 41 in a declassified military report she'd found while researching a paper about Cold War-era weapons design. The device had fascinated her because it represented a bridge between crude early nuclear weapons and modern sophisticated systems. Its firing mechanism used a combination of mechanical timers and chemical triggers that required an understanding of both traditional explosives and nuclear physics. The more she'd researched, the more she'd realized that the Mark 41 was a forgotten piece of military history that bridged multiple technological eras. Its designers had incorporated safety features that were advanced for their time, but would be unfamiliar to modern technicians trained on contemporary systems. The device was essentially a hybrid that required someone who understood both old-school explosive techniques and nuclear principles. Sarah looked at her notes, then at the emergency updates still flowing across her tablet. The official response team had been on site for 47 minutes. Their latest update indicated they were still trying to locate technical documentation and were proceeding with extreme caution while they waited for additional expertise from other facilities. She knew she should stay in her workshop. She knew that attempting to join the response effort would likely result in her being escorted out of the building and possibly losing her job. But she also knew that in her filing cabinet she had information that could save lives, and in her head she had an understanding of explosive systems that the facility's experts lacked. Sarah gathered her notes, grabbed her toolkit, and started walking towards Sector 7. She had no official authority, no proper clearance, and no backup plan. But she had something that everyone else seemed to be missing. She actually understood how the Mark 41 worked. The hallway leading to Sector 7 was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd witnessed 30 minutes earlier. Emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow, and she could hear the distant hum of ventilation systems working overtime to manage whatever contamination might be spreading through the facility. 2 security guards stood at the first checkpoint, but they were focused on their radios and barely glanced at Sarah as she walked past. Her Level 2 badge wouldn't normally grant her access to this area, but in the confusion of the emergency response, the automated systems were apparently defaulting to broader permissions. As she approached the final security door before Sector 7, she could hear voices from the other side, tense, frustrated conversations about missing documentation and unfamiliar systems. She took a deep breath, swiped her badge, and stepped into a situation that was about to change her life forever. The scene inside Sector 7 was controlled by pandemonium. Sarah stepped through the security door into a staging area that had been hastily converted into a command center. Folding tables held laptops, communication equipment, and stacks of printed documents. A large monitor displayed a live feed from inside the containment chamber, where the damaged Mark 41 sat like a metallic puzzle waiting to be solved. Dr. Marcus Webb stood at the center of it all, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled after an hour of crisis management. Around him, a team of 6 specialists huddled over laptops, their faces illuminated by screens showing technical diagrams that clearly weren't helping. Colonel Patricia Reeves, the military liaison, tapped her pen impatiently against her clipboard. How long until the backup team arrives from Los Alamos? 4 hours minimum, Webb replied, running his hand through his graying hair. We can't wait that long with the containment breach expanding. Sarah positioned herself behind a support column where she could observe without drawing immediate attention. The live feed showed the Mark 41 in devastating detail. The device sat partially embedded in concrete debris, its outer casing cracked open like an egg. Exposed wiring hung from the damaged sections, and a slow trickle of coolant created an ominous puddle beneath the weapon. But what caught Sarah's attention weren't the obvious damage points that had everyone else focused. It was a small component visible in the upper left corner of the screen, a brass housing that contained the device's primary arming mechanism. She'd seen that exact component in a declassified photograph from 1989, and she knew its function in ways that the current team clearly didn't. Dr. Webb called out Thomas Chen, the facility's newest hire and their supposed expert on nuclear safety systems. I'm seeing multiple trigger pathways that could cascade if we attempt standard disarmament procedures. This thing is more complex than anything in our contemporary protocols. Webb moved to Chen's station, studying the younger man's analysis. What's your recommendation? Honestly, we need to wait for the Los Alamos team. They might have access to original engineers who worked on these systems. Attempting disarmament with incomplete information could trigger exactly what we're trying to prevent. Sarah watched the exchange with growing concern. Through her unauthorized database access earlier, she'd learned that the containment breach was expanding at a rate of approximately 3 square feet per hour. The chemical leak that had started this crisis was continuing to eat away at the facility's infrastructure. Waiting 4 hours wasn't just inadvisable, it was potentially catastrophic. She studied the live feed more carefully, mentally cataloging every visible component against her research notes. The Mark 41's designers had been brilliant in their way, creating a system that was both sophisticated and deliberately obscure. During the Cold War, complexity had been a feature, not a bug. Enemy agents or unauthorized personnel would find the device nearly impossible to understand, even if they gained physical access. But that same complexity was now working against the people trying to disarm it. Sarah noticed something else that apparently hadn't occurred to the official response team. The damage pattern suggested that the chemical leak had affected the device's electronic components while leaving the mechanical systems largely intact. In newer nuclear weapons, this would be irrelevant because everything operates through integrated digital controls. But the Mark 41 had been designed with redundant systems that could operate independently. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Colonel Reeves, Webb was saying, I need you to contact Washington and brief them on our timeline. If we can't resolve this in the next 6 hours, they need to start evacuation procedures for the surrounding area. 6 hours. Sarah looked at her watch, then back at the screen. The brass housing she'd been studying showed signs of corrosion, but its underlying mechanism appeared intact. If her research was correct, that component controlled the device's primary safety interlock, a mechanical system that could be manually reset without interfacing with the damaged electronics. She pulled out her tablet and cross-referenced the live feed with her research notes. Everything she was seeing confirmed her hypothesis. The Mark 41 could be disarmed using purely mechanical procedures that bypassed the damaged electronic systems entirely. The process would be delicate and dangerous, but it was theoretically possible. The problem was convincing anyone to listen to her. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the support column. The conversation at the command center continued without anyone noticing her. She cleared her throat. "Excuse me." Dr. Webb looked up, his expression shifting from concentration to mild annoyance. "Sarah, what are you doing here? This area is restricted to essential personnel only. I have information about the Mark 41 that might be relevant to the situation." Jennifer Hayes glanced over from her laptop. "Sarah works in historical research. She catalogs old munitions that we keep in storage." The dismissive tone in Hayes' voice was exactly what Sarah had expected, but it still stung. She pressed forward anyway. "I've been studying the Mark 41 series for the past 3 years. I have detailed documentation about its mechanical systems that might help with disarmament." Colonel Reeves looked skeptical. "What kind of documentation?" Sarah held up her folder. Photocopied pages from the original technical manuals, engineering notes from the design team, and analysis of similar devices from the same era. I know how the safety interlocks function. Webb exchanged a glance with Chen, who shrugged. "Dr. Webb, with respect, we're dealing with an active nuclear emergency. This isn't the time for amateur research or historical curiosity. We need actual expertise." "I understand the mechanical trigger system," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. The device uses a dual-pathway arming mechanism that can be manually disabled through the brass housing visible in your camera feed. The electronic damage doesn't affect the mechanical components. Thomas Chen looked up from his laptop. The brass housing, that's just a protective cover for wiring conduits. No, it's not, Sarah replied firmly. It contains a clockwork timing mechanism and a chemical trigger interlock. If you treat it as a wiring conduit, you'll bypass the safety systems that could prevent accidental detonation. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Sarah could feel the weight of skeptical stares, the same kind of professional dismissal she'd experienced countless times over the years. But this time, lives hung in the balance. Dr. Webb studied her face carefully. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we can't base emergency procedures on theoretical research. We need verified protocols from qualified experts." "The qualified experts are 4 hours away," Sarah said. "And according to your own readings, the containment breach will be critical in less than 3 hours." She opened her folder and pulled out a hand-drawn diagram. "This is the Mark 41's primary arming sequence. I've cross-referenced it with declassified documents and similar devices from the same manufacturer. The mechanical systems operate independently from the electronics. You can disarm it manually." Colonel Reeves stepped forward to examine the diagram. Her expression was unreadable, but Sarah noticed that she studied the drawing with genuine attention rather than dismissive skepticism. "Where did you get this information?" the colonel asked. 3 years of research through military archives, declassified documents, and technical papers from the engineers who worked on these systems. I know it looks like amateur work, but I've verified every detail through multiple sources. The room remained tense as Webb weighed his options. Outside, the containment breach continued expanding, and the clock continued ticking toward an outcome that nobody wanted to contemplate. Colonel Reeves set down Sarah's diagram and walked to the main monitor displaying the live feed. She studied the brass housing that Sarah had identified, then turned back to the group. "Dr. Webb, what's the worst-case scenario if we proceed with current protocols?" Webb hesitated before answering. "Potential cascade failure resulting in partial detonation. The plutonium dispersal would contaminate approximately 60 square miles, requiring permanent evacuation of 3 townships. And if we wait for the Los Alamos team? The containment breach reaches critical mass in approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. At that point, the chemical corrosion will compromise the device's structural integrity regardless of our intervention." Sarah watched the exchange with growing frustration. The mathematics of the situation were straightforward, but institutional inertia was preventing anyone from acknowledging the obvious solution. Thomas Chen pulled up a new screen on his laptop. "I've been analyzing the device's power signal. The electronic systems are failing in sequence, but there's still active current flowing through multiple pathways. Any mechanical intervention could complete circuits that trigger the arming sequence." "That's exactly why the mechanical systems were designed to operate independently," Sarah said. "The engineers who built this anticipated electronic failures. The brass housing contains manual overrides that physically disconnect the trigger mechanisms." Jennifer Hayes shook her head dismissively. "Sarah, I appreciate your research, but we're talking about live nuclear materials. We can't gamble on interpretations of declassified documents." "They're not interpretations," Sarah replied, pulling out another document from her folder. "This is a maintenance log from the Pantex facility in Texas, dated 1994. It describes the exact procedure for manually disarming Mark 41 devices during routine servicing." She spread the photocopied pages across the nearest table. The text was faded but legible, with detailed step-by-step instructions and hand-drawn annotations in the margins. Dr. Webb moved closer to examine the documents. "Where did you obtain classified maintenance logs?" "They were declassified in 2018 as part of the Nuclear Transparency Initiative. I requested them through FOI specifically for my research into obsolete weapon systems." Colonel Reeves picked up one of the pages, studying the technical annotations. "These procedures require specialized tools and training. Do you have experience with actual disarmament operations?" Sarah felt her confidence wavered slightly. No direct experience with live devices, but I've practiced the procedures on deactivated training units in the facility's historical collection. The admission hung in the air like a confession of inadequacy. Sarah could see the doubt creeping back into everyone's faces, the familiar dismissal that had defined her career. Training units don't contain plutonium cores, Chen said quietly. The stress factors and safety margins are completely different. But the mechanical principles remain the same, Sarah countered. The brass housing mechanism operates through simple physics. Tension springs, gear ratios, chemical timing sequences. These aren't theoretical concepts, they're physical realities that function according to predictable laws. Webb walked back to the main monitor, studying the live feed with new attention. "Walk me through your proposed procedure." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. This was either her moment to contribute something meaningful or her chance to demonstrate her incompetence in front of people whose opinions could end her career. "The brass housing contains 3 separate mechanisms," she began, pointing to different areas on the screen. "The primary timing wheel, which controls detonation delay, the chemical interlock, which prevents accidental activation during transport, and the manual safety override, which can physically disconnect the entire firing sequence." She pulled out her tablet and brought up a detailed schematic she'd created based on her research. "The manual override is accessed through that circular opening you can see on the left side of the housing. It requires a specialized tool to turn the mechanism exactly 90 degrees counterclockwise." "What kind of specialized tool?" Colonel Reeves asked. Sarah reached into her toolkit and withdrew a peculiar-looking wrench with an unusual star-shaped head. "This is a Mark 41 service key. I fabricated it based on specifications in the maintenance documentation." Jennifer Hayes stared at the tool in disbelief. "You made your own nuclear weapons service equipment?" "I had it machined at a precision tooling shop in Boulder. The owner thought it was for vintage motorcycle restoration." Despite the tension, Thomas Chen let out a short laugh. "That's actually kinda brilliant." Sarah continued her explanation, her confidence growing as she got deeper into technical details. "After engaging the manual override, you disconnect the chemical timing mechanism by removing these 3 screws here." She pointed to barely visible components on the screen. "That isolates the mechanical systems from any residual electronic signals." "How long would the entire procedure take?" Webb asked. "Approximately 12 minutes, assuming no complications. The most delicate part is the initial override engagement. Too much force will snap the timing wheel. Too little won't properly disconnect the firing sequence." Colonel Reeves studied the monitor again, then turned to face the group. "I need honest assessments from everyone. Can our current approach succeed within the available time frame?" The question sparked a series of uncomfortable exchanges. Jennifer Hayes admitted that their electronic analysis had revealed more damaged systems than initially apparent. Thomas Chen acknowledged that their standard disarmament protocols weren't designed for hybrid mechanical-electronic devices. Dr. Webb confessed that waiting for the Los Alamos team might result in attempting disarmament after the containment breach reached critical levels. "What about remote disarmament?" Chen suggested. "The facility's robotic systems aren't designed for precision work on this scale," Hayes replied. "We'd need tactile feedback that our remote equipment can't provide." Sarah felt the conversation shifting in her direction, but she also sensed the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. If she was wrong about the mechanical systems, if her research contained errors, if her homemade tools didn't function properly, the consequences would be measured in lives lost and communities destroyed. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The Mark 41 has a fail-safe mechanism that activates if the device detects tampering. If we approach this incorrectly, it could trigger immediate detonation rather than dispersal over time." The room fell silent, except for the steady hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of emergency generators. Dr. Webb looked directly at Sarah for the first time since she'd entered the room. "Are you confident that your procedure would avoid triggering the failsafe?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Yes. The manual override was designed specifically to prevent failsafe activation during authorized disarmament. It's the safest approach available given our current circumstances. And if you're wrong? Sarah considered the question before answering. If I'm wrong, the outcome will be the same as if we do nothing. The only difference is timing. Colonel Reeves walked to the communication station and picked up a secure phone. I need to brief Washington on our situation and get authorization for irregular procedures. While Reeves made her call, Webb approached Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Why didn't you ever apply for positions in bomb disposal or nuclear safety? I did, replied. 17 times over the past 12 years. Every application was rejected due to insufficient credentials and lack of formal training in contemporary systems. Contemporary systems that apparently don't apply to this situation? Sarah nodded. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. Webb studied her face, perhaps seeing her clearly for their 15 years of working in the same facility. If we proceed with your plan, you'll need to be the one to execute it. No one else understands the procedures well enough to adapt if complications arise. The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a lead blanket. In all her years of research and preparation, she had never seriously considered that she might someday be the person responsible for implementing her theoretical knowledge in a life-or-death scenario. Colonel Reeves returned from her phone call with an expression that revealed nothing about the conversation's outcome. Washington wants a full technical briefing on the proposed procedure. They're assembling a panel of experts to review the approach. How long will that take? Webb asked. Reeves checked her watch. 90 minutes minimum. Sarah looked at the countdown timer on the main display. 90 minutes would leave them with less than an hour before the containment breach reached critical mass. Even if Washington approved her procedure, there would be almost no margin for error or unexpected complications. The mathematics of survival had just become significantly more challenging. The secure video conference with Washington began exactly on schedule, with Sarah facing a wall-mounted screen displaying 6 stern faces from various government agencies. General Patricia Hawthorne from the Pentagon led the inquiry, flanked by representatives from the Department of Energy, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and Homeland Security. Mrs. Mitchell, General Hawthorne began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affect national security. We've reviewed your personnel file and found no formal training in nuclear weapon systems. Explain why we should authorize an untested procedure based on your hobby research. Sarah felt the familiar sting of professional dismissal, but this time lives hung in the balance. Generally, my research isn't recreational. I've spent 3 years systematically analyzing Mark 41 systems using declassified technical documentation, maintenance logs, and engineering specifications. I understand these devices better than anyone currently available. Dr. Richard Steinberg from the Department of Energy leaned forward on screen. Understanding and executing are vastly different skills. Nuclear disarmament requires precision that can't be learned from textbooks. With respect, Dr. Steinberg, your contemporary training programs don't address devices like the Mark 41. Your protocols assume digital interfaces and integrated safety systems that this weapon doesn't possess. Colonel Reeves stepped into the camera frame. General Hawthorne, our containment breach will reach critical mass in 103 minutes. The Los Alamos team won't arrive for another 2 hours. We need to make a decision based on available resources. The screen displayed a new participant joining the conference, Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Sarah recognized her name from several technical papers about nuclear weapons safety systems. Ms. Mitchell, Dr. Rodriguez said, I've been reviewing the documentation you provided. Your analysis of the mechanical override system appears technically sound, but there's one critical element missing from your procedure. Sarah's heart sank. After all her research, had she overlooked something fundamental? The chemical timing mechanism you described, how do you account for potential corrosion in the activating compounds? These devices have been in storage for decades. Sarah felt a surge of relief. This was a question she could answer definitively. Dr. Rodriguez, I anticipated that concern. The Mark 41 uses a sealed capsule system with an inert atmosphere to prevent degradation. Even if the outer casing is compromised, the internal timing compounds remain stable for approximately 50 years under proper storage conditions. How can you be certain of the storage conditions for this specific device? Sarah pulled up her tablet and accessed the facility's maintenance database. I cross-referenced the device serial number with storage logs. This particular Mark 41 was transferred to our facility in 1998 and has been maintained in climate-controlled conditions with regular atmospheric testing. The most recent inspection was 18 months ago and showed no signs of chemical degradation. Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances with someone off-camera before responding. That's surprisingly thorough research for someone without security clearance for those records. I may not have formal clearance, but I understand how to navigate government databases effectively, Sarah replied, choosing not to mention the questionable legality of some of her access methods. General Hawthorne consulted with her advisors in a conversation that the microphones didn't pick up clearly. When she returned her attention to the camera, her expression had shifted slightly. Ms. Mitchell, assume we authorize your procedure. What contingencies do you have if the device doesn't respond as expected? Sarah had spent sleepless nights considering exactly that scenario. The procedure includes 3 checkpoint moments where I can assess the device's response and abort if necessary. The manual override is designed to fail safely. If something goes wrong during the initial stages, the device defaults to its current unstable state rather than triggering immediate detonation. And if something goes wrong during the final stages? Sarah met the general's gaze through the camera. If the procedure fails after the halfway point, the device will likely detonate within 15 minutes rather than degrade over several hours. But that outcome is identical to what happens if we take no action and wait for a containment breach. The brutal honesty of her answer seemed to resonate with the military personnel on the call. General Hawthorne consulted her notes before speaking again. Dr. Webb, what is your professional assessment of Ms. Mitchell's competence to execute this procedure? Webb looked uncomfortable with the question, but answered honestly. General, Sarah has demonstrated technical knowledge that exceeds our current team's understanding of this specific weapon system. Her research methodology appears sound, and her analysis addresses problems that our standard protocols can't solve. That's not what I asked, Doctor. Is she competent to manually disarm a live nuclear weapon? The room fell silent, except for electronic humming and distant ventilation. Sarah realized that this moment would define not just the immediate crisis, but potentially the rest of her career. I believe she is our best available option, Webb said finally. Dr. Rodriguez spoke up again from the screen. Ms. Mitchell, I need you to walk me through the most dangerous moment in your procedure. What single step poses the greatest risk? Sarah didn't hesitate, engaging the manual override initially. The timing wheel mechanism requires exactly 18 pounds of rotational force applied steadily over a 6-second period. Too much force snaps the wheel and triggers the failsafe. Too little doesn't properly engage the disconnect mechanism. How do you know the precise force requirements? The maintenance documentation includes torque specifications for all critical components. I've practiced the motion on deactivated training units until I can apply the exact pressure consistently. Practiced how many times? Approximately 400 repetitions over the past 6 months. The number seemed to surprise everyone, both in the room and on screen. Dr. Rodriguez looked genuinely impressed. That level of preparation suggests serious commitment to understanding the mechanics involved. General Hawthorne held up her hand to pause the technical discussion. This is ultimately a command decision based on incomplete information and unacceptable alternatives. Ms. Mitchell, if we authorize this procedure, you understand that failure could result in immediate nuclear detonation. Yes, General. And you understand that success or failure, your actions will be subject to extensive investigation and potential legal consequences? Sarah hadn't considered the legal implications, but she nodded anyway. I understand. General Hawthorne consulted with her advisors again, this time in a discussion that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Sarah watched the countdown timer on the main display, feeling each passing second as a physical weight. When General Hawthorne returned to the microphone, her voice carried the authority of final decision. Ms. Mitchell, you are hereby authorized to attempt disarmament of the device using your proposed procedure. Dr. Webb will oversee the operation, and Colonel Reeves will maintain direct communication with this command center throughout the process. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror that nearly made her knees buckle. After years of being dismissed and marginalized, she was suddenly responsible for preventing a nuclear catastrophe. The authorization comes with conditions, the general continued. If at any point the procedure deviates from your stated plan, you will abort immediately. If you encounter any unexpected resistance or responses from the device, you will cease activity and report to this command center. Is that understood? Understood, General. Dr. Webb, you will provide continuous technical oversight and have authority to abort the procedure if you observe any actions that deviate from authorized protocols. Webb nodded grimly. Acknowledged. The screen went dark, leaving the local team to prepare for an operation that would either save lives or end them in spectacular fashion. Sarah looked at her toolkit, her research notes, and the live feed of the damaged Mark 41, knowing that the next hour would determine whether 15 years of patient research had been preparation for this moment or elaborate self-deception. Outside, the containment breach continued its relentless expansion, and time continued its countdown toward an outcome that only Sarah's hands could now prevent. Sarah stood at the entrance to the containment chamber, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The heavy radiation suit felt awkward and restrictive, nothing like the lightweight protective gear she'd worn during her practice sessions with deactivated training units. Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the suit's communication system. Sarah, we're showing elevated radiation levels near the device. Your exposure time is limited to 45 minutes maximum before mandatory evacuation. Understood, Sarah replied, checking the dosimeter clipped to her suit's chest panel. The device would provide continuous monitoring of her radiation exposure, giving audible warnings if she approached dangerous levels. The containment chamber itself was smaller than it appeared on the monitor feeds. The damaged Mark 41 sat in the center of the space, surrounded by concrete debris and the slowly spreading puddle of chemical coolant that had started the entire crisis. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that made everything appear more ominous than the sanitized view provided by the external cameras. Sarah approached the device methodically, her toolkit secured to her belt and her research notes protected in a waterproof case. Up close, the damage was both better and worse than expected. The chemical corrosion had eaten through more of the outer casing than the camera feeds revealed, but the brass housing containing the mechanical systems appeared intact. I can see the primary access point, she reported, kneeling beside the device. The brass housing shows some surface corrosion, but no structural damage. The manual override mechanism appears accessible. Through her earpiece, she could hear the tension in Colonel Reeves' voice. Sarah, we're monitoring your vitals and radiation exposure. Current levels are within acceptable parameters, but that chemical puddle is expanding toward your position. Sarah glanced at the creeping edge of coolant, now less than 3 feet from where she knelt. The acrid smell penetrated even through her suit's filtration system, reminding her that time was running short in multiple ways. She opened her toolkit and withdrew the specialized service keys she'd fabricated based on declassified specifications. The star-shaped head fit perfectly into the manual override access port, exactly as her research had predicted. But when she applied gentle pressure to test the mechanism's resistance, she felt something unexpected. There's additional corrosion inside the access port, she reported. The override mechanism is binding slightly. It's going to require more force than calculated. Webb's response came immediately. How much more force? Sarah tested the resistance carefully, drawing on hundreds of hours practicing similar motions. Approximately 22 to 24 pounds instead of 18. Still within the safety margin, but closer to the failure threshold. Can you compensate for the additional resistance? Yes, but it means slower application of force over a longer period. The engagement time will be closer to 10 seconds instead of 6. She could hear hurried consultation in the background before Webb responded. "Proceed with the modified parameters. We trust your judgment." Sarah positioned herself carefully, bracing her body to apply steady rotational force without sudden jerks that might damage the mechanism. The service key settled into the access port with satisfying precision, and she began the delicate process of engaging the manual override. The resistance was significant but consistent. As she applied pressure, Sarah felt the internal mechanism beginning to respond. There was a subtle vibration through the tool as gears engaged, followed by a soft clicking sound that indicated the timing wheel was disengaging from the primary firing sequence. "First checkpoint successful," she announced. "Manual override is engaged. The timing wheel has disconnected from the electrical systems." Through her earpiece, she could hear audible sighs of relief from the command center. But Sarah knew the most dangerous part was still ahead. With the manual override engaged, she now had access to the chemical timing mechanism, the component that could trigger immediate detonation if handled improperly. Sarah moved to the second phase of the procedure, locating the 3 specialized screws that secured the chemical timing housing. These weren't standard components. They used a proprietary head design that required a specific tool to prevent unauthorized tampering. Fortunately, her research had included detailed specifications for fabricating the necessary equipment. "Beginning chemical timing disconnect," she reported, withdrawing a second tool from her kit. "The chemical housing appears stable, but I can smell trace amounts of the timing compound through my suit's filtration." That was concerning. If the chemical timing compound was beginning to leak, it meant the containment capsules were more compromised than expected. Sarah worked more quickly, but maintained the steady precision that the procedure demanded. The first screw came out smoothly, but the second showed signs of chemical corrosion that made removal more difficult. Sarah applied steady pressure while rotating the specialized tool, feeling the damaged threads gradually surrender their grip. "The second screw is corroded but responding. Chemical compound smell is getting stronger. The containment capsules are definitely compromised." Colonel Reeves' voice carried new urgency. "Sarah, how does that affect the disarmament timeline?" "If the chemical timing compound continues leaking, it could create an unstable environment that triggers detonation independent of the mechanical systems. I need to work faster." The third screw proved to be the most challenging. Corrosion had essentially welded it to the housing threads, and standard removal techniques weren't working. Sarah tried several approaches, each more aggressive than the last, while monitoring the device for any signs of negative response. "Third screw is seized. I'm going to try thermal expansion to break the corrosion bond." She withdrew a small heating element from her toolkit, a specialized device designed for precisely this type of situation. Applied carefully to the screw head, the heat would cause the metal to expand slightly, potentially breaking the corrosion seal without affecting the sensitive timing mechanisms below. "Temperature application successful," Sarah announced after several tense minutes. "Screw is responding now." As the final screw came free, Sarah felt a significant shift in the device's internal mechanisms. The chemical timing housing lifted away cleanly, revealing the intricate clockwork mechanism that had made the Mark 41 both sophisticated and dangerous. "The chemical timing system is now isolated," she reported. "I can see the clockwork mechanism clearly. All components appear to be in the configuration described in the maintenance documentation." But as Sarah examined the exposed mechanism, she noticed something that hadn't been mentioned in any of her research materials. There was a fourth component, a small brass cylinder with what appeared to be a manual activation switch. "Dr. Webb, I'm seeing an additional component that wasn't in the technical documentation. It looks like a manual activation override, but it's not mentioned in any of my research materials." The silence from the command center stretched longer than comfortable before Webb responded. "Can you describe the component in detail?" Sarah studied the mysterious cylinder carefully. "It's approximately 2 inches long, brass construction, with a spring-loaded switch mechanism. There are serial numbers etched into the surface, and it appears to be connected to the primary firing circuit through a separate pathway." She could hear rapid conversation in the background, followed by the sound of computer keyboards clicking frantically. Dr. Rodriguez's voice came through the communication system, apparently having joined the local command center. "Sarah, That component is a field modification that was added to some Mark 41 units during the 1990s. It's a manual detonation override that allows immediate activation in combat situations. The implications hit Sarah immediately. The device was more dangerous than anyone had realized, with a backup detonation system that could function independently of the primary mechanisms she'd been working to disable. "How does that affect the disarmament procedure?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The manual override must be disabled before you complete the primary disarmament sequence. If it remains active when you disconnect the main firing circuit, it could trigger automatic detonation. Sarah stared at the unexpected component, realizing that all her preparation and research had suddenly become incomplete. She was facing a modification that she'd never studied, with no documentation and no practice experience, while kneeling next to a live nuclear weapon in an increasingly toxic environment. The chemical coolant had crept closer during her work, now less than 18 inches from her position. Her radiation exposure was approaching the warning threshold, and she could smell the acrid timing compound growing stronger with each breath. "I need technical guidance on disabling the manual override," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the complexity of her situation. "We're pulling up everything we have on field modifications," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Give us 2 minutes to analyze the options." Sarah looked at the countdown timer display visible through the chamber's window. 2 minutes would leave her with less than 30 minutes to complete the disarmament before containment breach reached critical mass. Meanwhile, her radiation exposure continued climbing, the chemical environment became more dangerous, and she faced a component that could end everything if she guessed wrong about its function. For the first time since entering the chamber, Sarah felt the full weight of the impossible situation she'd volunteered to solve. Sarah's dosimeter began emitting soft warning beeps as her radiation exposure approached critical levels. The chemical coolant had advanced to within 12 inches of her position, forcing her to shift awkwardly while maintaining precise hand positioning over the device's exposed mechanisms. Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system with newfound urgency. "Sarah, we've located partial documentation on the field modification. The manual override is spring-loaded and designed to activate if the primary circuit is interrupted without proper disarmament sequence." "What constitutes a proper disarmament sequence for the override?" Sarah asked, studying the mysterious brass cylinder more closely. She could see hairline fractures in its casing that suggested the component was under internal pressure. "That's the problem," Rodriguez replied. "The documentation is incomplete. We know the override requires a specific deactivation code, but the code varies by device serial number and deployment date. We don't have access to the code database." Sarah felt her stomach drop. After all her preparation, she was facing a component that required information she couldn't possibly have researched. How long would it take to locate the code database? "Minimum 4 hours, assuming we can find personnel with appropriate clearance who remember the system." Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear Colonel Reeves updating someone on the communication timeline. The words "containment breach critical in 23 minutes" cut through the technical discussion like a blade. Sarah examined the manual override more carefully, looking for any identifying marks or mechanisms that might provide clues about its operation. The serial numbers etched into the brass surface were partially corroded, but she could make out enough digits to potentially identify the component's specifications. "I can see partial serial numbers on the override mechanism," she reported. "The first 6 digits are 89124, followed by what looks like either an 8, then more corrosion." She could hear rapid typing in the background as someone searched databases for matching serial number patterns. While waiting for results, Sarah noticed something else about the override mechanism that hadn't been immediately apparent. The spring-loaded switch wasn't just a simple activation button. It appeared to be part of a more complex mechanism that included a rotating collar around the cylinder's base. The collar had tiny markings that looked like they might be numerical indicators. "Dr. Rodriguez, the override has a rotating collar with numerical markings around the base. It looks like it might be part of the deactivation sequence." "Can you read the numbers clearly?" Sarah adjusted her position to get better lighting on the component. I can see markings from 0 through 9 with what appears to be an alignment indicator pointing to the number 6. The typing sounds intensified, followed by excited conversation that the microphones didn't pick up clearly. When Rodriguez returned to the communication channel, her voice carried new hope. "Sarah, we may have found something. The rotating collar system was used on override modifications installed between 1993 and 1996. The deactivation sequence typically involves rotating the collar to align with specific numbers based on the device's manufacturing date." What's the manufacturing date for this Mark 41? Webb's voice joined the conversation. According to our records, this device was manufactured in October 1987. Sarah felt a moment of confusion. But you said the override modifications were installed between 1993 and 1996. How would the deactivation sequence be based on a manufacturing date from 1987? "Good catch," Rodriguez replied. "The sequence would be based on the modification installation date, not the original manufacturing date. We need to determine when this specific override was installed." The dosimeter's warning beeps were becoming more frequent, indicating that Sarah's radiation exposure was approaching mandatory evacuation levels. The chemical coolant had crept even closer, now less than 10 inches from her knees. "I don't have time for archival research," Sarah said bluntly. "Can we determine the installation date from physical evidence on the device itself?" She began examining the override mechanism more systematically, looking for any stamps, etchings, or other markings that might indicate when the modification had been installed. Near the base of the brass cylinder, partially obscured by corrosion, she found what appeared to be a date stamp. "I found something," she announced. "There's a date stamp that looks like 05-94, May 1994, presumably." "That fits the timeline for the collar-based deactivation system," Rodriguez confirmed. "The sequence for a May 1994 installation would be 0-5-9-4, rotating the collar to align each number with the indicator in sequence." Sarah positioned her fingers carefully around the rotating collar. The mechanism moved smoothly despite its age, clicking softly as it rotated through different number positions. She aligned the collar to 0 as the first step in the sequence. "Starting deactivation sequence," she reported, collar aligned to 0. As she rotated to the number 5, Sarah felt a subtle change in the mechanism's internal pressure. The spring-loaded switch seemed to relax slightly, suggesting that the sequence was having the intended effect on the override's activation state. Number 5 aligned. Internal pressure appears to be decreasing. The rotation to 9 produced another subtle shift, followed by a barely audible click from deep within the mechanism. Sarah was beginning to feel confident that the deactivation sequence was working as intended. But as she began rotating the collar toward the final number 4, something unexpected happened. The collar suddenly became much more difficult to turn, as if the internal mechanism was binding or encountering unexpected resistance. "Problem," Sarah announced. "The collar is binding as I approach the final number. It feels like something is preventing proper alignment." Through her earpiece, she could hear urgent consultation between Rodriguez and other technical experts who had apparently joined the command center team. The conversation was too rapid and technical for her to follow completely, but she caught fragments about degraded internal components and chemical interference. "Sarah," Rodriguez said finally, "the binding could be caused by chemical corrosion affecting the internal mechanism. You may need to apply more force than normal, but be very careful not to exceed the mechanism's structural limits." Sarah tested the resistance carefully, trying to gauge how much additional force would be required. The collar was definitely binding, but she could feel that the internal mechanism was still functional beneath the corrosion. "I'm going to apply gradually increasing pressure," she decided. "If the mechanism fails catastrophically, we're not any worse off than we were before." She began rotating the collar toward 4 with steady, controlled pressure. The resistance was significant, but she could feel the mechanism gradually responding. There was a grinding sensation as corroded components forced their way past accumulated deposits, followed by a sudden release as the collar snapped into proper alignment. The moment the collar aligned with the number 4, several things happened simultaneously. The spring-loaded switch visibly relaxed, settling into a different position than before. A soft hissing sound came from within the mechanism, suggesting that internal pressure was being released. Most importantly, a small green indicator light that Sarah hadn't noticed before began blinking steadily. "Override deactivation appears successful," she reported with profound relief. "Green indicator is blinking, internal pressure released, spring mechanism has relaxed." The command center erupted in audible celebration, but Sarah knew her work was far from finished. With the manual override neutralized, she could now proceed with the primary disarmament sequence, but her time and environmental conditions were becoming increasingly critical. Her dosimeter was now beeping almost continuously, indicating radiation levels that were approaching the absolute maximum safe threshold. The chemical coolant had advanced to within 6 inches of her position, and the acrid smell of timing compounds was becoming overwhelming even through her suit's filtration system. "Primary disarmament sequence," Sarah announced, turning her attention back to the device's main firing mechanism. "Estimated time to completion 8 minutes. Colonel Reeves's voice cut through the technical chatter. "Sarah, containment breach reaches critical mass in 17 minutes. You're cutting this very close." Sarah positioned her tools for the final phase of the disarmament procedure, knowing that everything now depended on her ability to execute flawlessly under conditions that were deteriorating with each passing second. The next 8 minutes would determine whether her years of patient research would save lives, or whether everyone's worst fears would be realized in spectacular fashion. Behind her, the chemical coolant continued its relentless advance, and above her, the countdown timer marked each second toward an outcome that only her hands could now control. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she began the primary disarmament sequence, her movements guided by hundreds of hours of practice and 3 years of meticulous research. The dosimeter's continuous beeping had become a background soundtrack to her work, each electronic chirp marking another increment of radiation exposure that brought her closer to mandatory evacuation. The chemical coolant was now less than 4 inches from her knees, forcing her to work in an increasingly cramped position while maintaining the delicate touch required for the final procedures. "Beginning primary circuit disconnection," Sarah announced, withdrawing a specialized tool designed to interface with the device's main power coupling. The primary circuit consists of 3 separate pathways that had to be disconnected in a specific sequence to prevent cascading failures. Sarah had memorized this sequence through countless repetitions, but executing it on a live device surrounded by toxic chemicals and increasing radiation was entirely different from practice sessions. She began with the secondary power coupling, a small connector that provided backup power to the timing mechanisms. The connector came free cleanly, accompanied by a soft click that indicated proper disconnection. 1 pathway down, 2 to go. Moving to the primary power coupling. The primary power coupling was larger and more complex, designed with multiple redundant connections to prevent accidental disconnection during normal handling. Sarah had to manipulate 3 separate mechanisms simultaneously while applying exactly the right amount of force to avoid damaging the delicate internal components. As she worked on the primary coupling, Sarah noticed that the device's internal mechanisms were beginning to wind down. The soft clicking and whirring sounds that had been audible since she'd begun the disarmament were growing quieter, suggesting that the Mark 41 systems are responding properly to her interventions. Primary power coupling requires simultaneous manipulation of 3 separate mechanisms, she updated. Internal sounds are decreasing, which indicates proper system shutdown in progress. The coupling resisted her initial attempts at disconnection, but Sarah had anticipated this based on her research. The mechanism was designed to require deliberate, sustained effort to prevent accidental activation during transport or storage. She applied steady pressure while rotating 2 separate components, feeling the internal mechanisms gradually surrender their connections. "Primary power pathway disconnected," she announced with satisfaction. "Final pathway remaining." But as Sarah positioned her tools for the final disconnection, her dosimeter suddenly shifted from steady beeping to a rapid, urgent alarm. Her radiation exposure had crossed into the danger zone, meaning she had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before mandatory evacuation regardless of the disarmament status. Radiation exposure is critical. Colonel Reeves' voice cut through the communication channel. Sarah, you need to begin evacuation procedures immediately. Negative, Sarah replied firmly. I'm 30 seconds from completing the disarmament sequence. Final power pathway disconnection in progress. The final coupling was the most complex of the three, incorporating both mechanical and chemical elements that had to be neutralized simultaneously. Sarah had practiced this procedure more than any other, knowing it would be the most challenging under real conditions. She inserted her specialized tool into the coupling mechanism while simultaneously applying a chemical neutralizing agent to the adjacent timing components. The neutralizer would render the chemical triggers inert, while the mechanical disconnection would physically separate the firing circuit from the nuclear material. Chemical neutralizer applied, Sarah reported. Mechanical disconnection commencing. The final coupling was the most complex of the three, incorporating both mechanical and chemical elements that had to be neutralized simultaneously. Sarah had practiced this procedure more than any other, knowing it would be the most challenging under real conditions. She inserted her specialized tool into the coupling mechanism while simultaneously applying a chemical neutralizing agent to the adjacent timing components. The neutralizer would render the chemical triggers inert, while the mechanical disconnection would physically separate the firing circuit from the nuclear material. Chemical neutralizer applied, Sarah reported. Mechanical disconnection commencing. The coupling mechanism required a precise combination of rotation and linear pressure applied in a specific rhythm that matched the device's internal timing cycles. Sarah had spent months perfecting this motion, practicing until she could execute it flawlessly even with her eyes closed. As she began the final disconnection sequence, the Mark 41's internal mechanisms produced a series of clicks and mechanical sounds that indicated the device was shutting down properly. But with 10 seconds remaining in the sequence, something unexpected happened. The chemical coolant reached her position, seeping through the protective material of her radiation suit at the knees. The acidic fluid began eating through the suit's outer layer, creating a burning sensation that threatened to break her concentration during the most critical moment of the entire procedure. Chemical coolant breach, Sarah announced through gritted teeth. Coolant is compromising my suit integrity, but the final disconnection is 90% complete. Through her earpiece, she could hear urgent conversations about emergency extraction and medical protocols, but Sarah blocked out everything except the delicate mechanism beneath her hands. 5 more seconds of perfect execution would complete the disarmament. 5 seconds of maintained concentration while acid ate through her protective equipment. She completed the final rotation of the coupling mechanism, feeling the last connection separate cleanly from the nuclear material. Immediately, the Mark 41's internal sounds ceased entirely, replaced by a profound silence that indicated complete system shutdown. Primary disarmament sequence completed successfully, Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the burning sensation spreading across her knees. All power pathways disconnected, nuclear material is isolated from all firing mechanisms. The command center erupted in celebration, but Sarah wasn't finished. According to her research, the disarmament required a final verification step to ensure that all systems had properly shut down and that the nuclear material was in a stable configuration. She withdrew a specialized measuring device from her toolkit, a simple gauge that would indicate whether the plutonium core was still under compression from the firing mechanisms. If the gauge showed normal atmospheric pressure, the disarmament was successful. If it showed continued compression, something had gone wrong with her procedure. Conducting final verification, Sarah reported, applying the gauge to a specific access port on the device's outer casing. Checking plutonium core compression status. The gauge needle moved slowly across its stale before settling on a reading that made Sarah's heart race with relief. Normal atmospheric pressure, no compression, complete isolation of nuclear material from all trigger mechanisms. Verification successful, she announced. Plutonium core shows normal atmospheric pressure. Nuclear material is completely isolated and stable. The silence that followed her announcement was broken by Dr. Webb's voice, carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Sarah, are you confirming that the device is fully disarmed and poses no threat of nuclear detonation?" "Confirmed," Sarah replied. "The Mark 41 is completely disarmed. Nuclear material is stable and isolated. The device poses no further threat." As the reality of her success settled over everyone, Sarah became aware that the chemical coolant had eaten through her suit at multiple points and was beginning to affect her skin. The radiation alarms were now screaming continuously, indicating that she had exceeded safe exposure levels and needed immediate medical attention. "I need emergency extraction," Sarah said calmly. "Chemical coolant has compromised my suit integrity, and my radiation exposure is beyond safe limits." Within seconds, the containment chamber filled with emergency response personnel in full hazmat gear. They lifted Sarah away from the now harmless device and rushed her toward decontamination protocols that would determine whether her exposure to radiation and chemicals would have long-term health consequences. As they carried her from the chamber, Sarah looked back at the Mark 41 one final time. The device that had threatened thousands of lives now sat silent and harmless, its nuclear material safely isolated thanks to research that everyone had dismissed as amateur hobby work. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood before a joint congressional committee receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The ceremony was largely symbolic. Her real reward had come in the form of multiple job offers from every major nuclear research facility in the country, along with the knowledge that her years of patient, overlooked research had ultimately saved lives. During her acceptance speech, Sarah made a point that resonated beyond the immediate audience. Sometimes the most important expertise comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person you need when everything else fails. The Mark 41 incident led to comprehensive reviews of nuclear safety protocols, improved communication between research facilities, and new policies ensuring that unconventional expertise would be recognized and utilized in emergency situations. Sarah's experience became a case study in crisis management and the importance of diverse technical perspectives. But for Sarah herself, the most satisfying outcome was simpler. She never again had to hear that she didn't understand explosives. Her business cards now read Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Senior Nuclear Safety Consultant, and when she spoke, people listened. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's success created ripple effects throughout the nuclear security establishment that nobody had anticipated. Within hours of the successful disarmament, classified communication networks buzzed with reports of the incident, and senior officials who had never heard of Sarah suddenly wanted detailed briefings on her background and methodologies. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived at the Colorado facility the following morning, ostensibly to conduct a technical debrief, but actually to understand how someone outside the official nuclear establishment had developed expertise that surpassed their own. She found Sarah in the facility's medical wing, undergoing treatment for chemical burns and radiation monitoring. "Mrs. Mitchell," Rodriguez began, settling into a chair beside Sarah's hospital bed, "your procedure yesterday saved approximately 300,000 people from potential radiation exposure. I need to understand how you developed knowledge that our best experts lacked." Sarah adjusted her position carefully, mindful of the bandages covering her chemically burned knees. "Dr. Rodriguez, I didn't develop special knowledge. I just paid attention to information that everyone else considered obsolete. But your understanding of the Mark 41 systems exceeded that of engineers who designed similar weapons. That level of expertise doesn't develop accidentally." Sarah considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "I think the difference is motivation. Your experts study contemporary systems because that's their job. I studied historical systems because I was genuinely fascinated by the engineering challenges that previous generations solved with limited technology." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "Walk me through your research methodology. How did you identify which historical systems were worth studying?" "I started with declassified documents about weapons that had been decommissioned or replaced by newer systems. Most researchers ignore these files because the weapons are no longer active, but I realized that understanding older systems provides insight into fundamental principles that remain constant across generations." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. Walk me through your research methodology. How did you identify which historical systems were worth studying? I started with declassified documents about weapons that had been decommissioned or replaced by newer systems. Most researchers ignore these files because the weapons are no longer active, but I realized that— Sarah, Rodriguez said finally, I'm going to be direct. The Department of Energy needs people with your analytical skills and your ability to think beyond conventional boundaries. We'd like to offer you a position as a senior technical consultant with security clearance that would give you access to classified research databases. Sarah stared at Rodriguez in surprise. After 15 years of rejection and dismissal, she was being offered exactly the kind of position she'd always wanted. What would my responsibilities involve? Initially, conducting comprehensive analysis of historical nuclear systems to identify potential vulnerabilities in current security protocols. Long-term, you'd help develop training programs that incorporate lessons from obsolete technologies into contemporary safety procedures. The offer represented vindication of everything Sarah had worked toward, but it also meant leaving behind the independent research that had made her expertise possible in the first place. Can I maintain my personal research projects? Not only can you maintain them, we'd encourage you to expand them. Your independent perspective is exactly what our establishment needs to avoid institutional blind spots. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in Washington, D.C., briefing a joint task force of military officials, government scientists, and private contractors about systemic weaknesses in nuclear security protocols. The audience included many of the same people who had previously dismissed her applications for entry-level positions. The Mark 41 incident illustrates a fundamental problem with contemporary nuclear security, Sarah explained, standing before a conference table filled with senior officials. We've become so focused on defending against sophisticated threats that we've forgotten how to handle simple mechanical failures. General Patricia Hawthorne, who had authorized Sarah's emergency procedure, leaned forward with interest. Elaborate on that assessment. Modern nuclear security assumes that any threat will involve complex electronic warfare or cyber attacks. But the Mark 41 failed due to basic chemical corrosion affecting mechanical components that were designed 50 years ago. Our current experts didn't recognize the threat because they'd never studied the older systems. Sarah advanced to her next slide, showing a timeline of nuclear weapons development. We have approximately 400 older nuclear devices in various storage facilities across the country. Most of these weapons use hybrid mechanical electronic systems that bridge different technological eras. If we experience similar failures with other devices, our current response capabilities are inadequate. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had overseen Sarah's emergency operation, spoke up from the back of the room. What specific recommendations do you have for addressing these vulnerabilities? 3 primary initiatives, Sarah replied. First, comprehensive documentation of all historical nuclear systems, including detailed technical manuals and maintenance procedures. Second, training programs that teach contemporary specialists to work with obsolete technologies. Third, development of specialized tools and equipment for servicing older devices. The briefing continued for another hour, with Sarah fielding technical questions that demonstrated the depth of her expertise. By the session's conclusion, she had received preliminary approval for a multi-million-dollar research initiative that would address systemic vulnerabilities in nuclear security infrastructure. But Sarah's most significant impact came through her development of what became known as the Mitchell Protocol, a comprehensive framework for preserving and utilizing historical technical knowledge in modern security applications. The protocol required all nuclear facilities to maintain detailed documentation of obsolete systems and to train at least one specialist in historical technologies. The protocol's first major test came 18 months after the Mark 41 incident, when a storage facility in Nevada experienced a similar chemical leak affecting a decommissioned weapon from the 1970s. Unlike the Colorado crisis, the Nevada facility had a specialist trained in Sarah's methodologies, and the device was successfully disarmed within 2 hours without requiring emergency authorization from Washington. Sarah's influence extended beyond nuclear security into broader government technology policies. Her experience demonstrated how institutional bias against unconventional expertise could create dangerous blind spots in critical systems. Federal agencies began implementing new hiring practices that valued demonstrated competence over formal credentials. And research facilities developed programs to identify and cultivate expertise that existed outside traditional academic channels. 5 years after the Mark 41 incident, Sarah published a comprehensive textbook titled Historical Nuclear Systems: Engineering Principles and Security Applications. The book became required reading in nuclear engineering programs and established Sarah as a leading authority on the intersection between historical technology and contemporary security challenges. During the book's launch event at the National Press Club, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a dusty workshop in Colorado to recognition as one of the country's foremost nuclear security experts. The most important lesson from the Mark 41 incident isn't about nuclear weapons or emergency procedures, she told the gathered audience. It's about the danger of dismissing expertise simply because it doesn't fit conventional expectations. In a world of increasing technological complexity, we need people who understand not just where we're going, but where we've been. The old Mark 41 was eventually displayed in the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on nuclear safety and the importance of preserving technical knowledge across generations. A detailed placard next to the device told the complete story of how one woman's dedication to forgotten expertise had prevented a catastrophe that could have changed American history. Sarah continued her research from a state-of-the-art laboratory in Washington, but she never forgot the lessons learned in that cramped Colorado workshop. Every few months, she returned to the facility where her career had been transformed, speaking to new researchers about the importance of curiosity, persistence, and the courage to pursue knowledge that others might dismiss as irrelevant. In her final interview before retiring 20 years later, Sarah was asked what advice she would give to young researchers facing institutional skepticism about their work. Her response became legendary in scientific circles. Never let other people's inability to recognize value determine your commitment to finding truth. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from places that everyone else has forgotten to look at. The nuclear security protocols that Sarah developed remained in use decades after her retirement, protecting millions of people from threats that conventional thinking had failed to anticipate. But perhaps more importantly, her story inspired a generation of researchers to value curiosity over convention, depth over breadth, and patient expertise over institutional recognition. And in research facilities around the world, scientists working on seemingly obsolete technologies found validation in Sarah Mitchell's example, proof that dedication to understanding the past might be the key to securing the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.